The $50,000 bill trembled in Colonel William Thornfield's weathered hands as he watched the 8-year-old boy slip through the ranch fence toward Thunder, the 400-pound Brahman bull that had hospitalized 3 grown men. Tommy O'Sullivan's small frame looked impossibly fragile against the massive beast's gray hide. What happened next defied every law of nature the crowd had ever witnessed. Thunder, notorious for his rage, slowly lowered his enormous head as the orphaned boy extended a tiny palm. Miss Eleanor's coffee cup shattered against the wooden bleachers. Sheriff Bobby Ray's radio crackled with panicked dispatcher voices demanding backup. Aunt Maggie pressed her face against the fence slats, remembering how Tommy used to whisper to her late husband's hunting dogs, calming them after thunderstorms the same way he was now approaching certain death. "Sweet Jesus, somebody stop him!" Doc Henderson shouted, his 70-year-old legs already vaulting the fence. Who was this child, and what ancient magic flowed between boy and beast that could transform a killer into something almost gentle? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Millfield, Texas had seen better days. The drought-cracked earth stretched endlessly under a merciless August sun, where cattle once grazed on green pastures now reduced to stubble and dust. Main Street's faded storefronts told the story of a dying town, 3 empty buildings for every occupied one, their for-lease signs bleached white by relentless heat. The railroad had stopped coming through 5 years ago, taking most of the young folks with it, leaving behind the stubborn and the old. Tommy O'Sullivan knew every crack in the trailer park's gravel roads by heart. At 8 years old, he'd walked these paths for 18 months now, ever since the highway patrol officer knocked on Aunt Maggie's door with news that would shatter 2 lives forever. His parents' Chevy had skidded off Rain Creek Bridge during a spring storm, leaving behind only memories and a boy who'd learned too young that the people you love most can disappear without warning. The single-wide trailer Tommy called home sat at the end of Mockingbird Lane, its aluminum siding dented from years of Texas hailstorms. Inside, Aunt Margaret O'Sullivan moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed. At 52, Maggie's hands told the story of her survival, calloused from cleaning houses before dawn, soft from serving coffee at Miller's Diner, and gentle when she tucked Tommy into the narrow bunk bed that served as his entire world. Maggie had never planned on raising a child. Her marriage to Patrick had been childless by circumstance, not choice, and when cancer took him 5 years ago, she'd resigned herself to growing old alone. Tommy's arrival had awakened something she'd buried with her husband, the fierce protectiveness of a mother bear defending her cub. She worked 3 jobs now, waitressing at the diner from 5 a.m. to noon, cleaning the Methodist church twice a week, and scrubbing floors for wealthy ranch wives who paid her just enough to keep hope alive. The foreclosure notice had arrived on a Tuesday, crisp and official, demanding $2,400 in back rent within 72 hours. Maggie had stared at those numbers until they blurred, knowing her next paycheck wouldn't cover half that amount. She'd hidden the letter beneath her jewelry box, but Tommy had seen her crying over the kitchen table that night. And 8-year-old boys notice everything adults think they've hidden. 4 miles east of the trailer park, Thornfield Ranch sprawled across 10,000 acres of prime Texas grassland. The main house sat atop a gentle rise, its white columns and wraparound porch speaking of old money and older pride. Colonel William Thornfield had inherited more than land from his grandfather. He'd inherited the weight of 4 generations' expectations and the crushing responsibility of keeping a legacy alive in a world that no longer valued such things. The ranch employed half the county during good times, but these weren't good times. The colonel's ledgers told a story of mounting debts and dwindling hope, of medical bills that had consumed decades of careful savings, and of a proud man watching his family's empire crumble one unpaid invoice at a time. The Saturday morning crowd had been gathering since sunrise, drawn by whispers that had spread through Millfield like wildfire. Colonel Thornfield was offering $50,000, more money than most folks in town had ever seen in one place, to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to touch his bull. Thunder had earned his reputation the hard way through 3 years of documented aggression that had sent 2 cowboys to the hospital and made grown men cross themselves when his name came up in conversation. The bull stood in the center of a reinforced steel pen, his massive Brahman frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow the morning light. At 400 pounds, Thunder was a monument to raw power, his gray hide scarred from countless battles with fence posts and anyone foolish enough to get too close. His distinctive hump rose like a mountain between his shoulders, and his curved horns caught the Texas sun like polished bone. When he moved, the earth seemed to tremble beneath his hooves, and when he stood still, the very air grew heavy with the promise of violence. Colonel Thornfield climbed onto the makeshift platform he'd had his ranch hands construct the night before, his weathered face grim beneath the shadow of his Stetson. At 61, he still carried himself with military bearing, but 3 years of grief had carved deep lines around his eyes and turned his brown hair silver at the temples. The crowd of nearly 200 people fell silent as he raised his hand, their faces a mixture of excitement and fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," the colonel's voice carried across the gathered crowd like a thunderclap, "you all know why you're here. $50,000 cash money to anyone who can walk into that pen and lay their hands on Thunder for 30 seconds. 30 seconds, that's all. But I guarantee you there ain't a man among you with the stones to try it." The crowd stirred uneasily. $50,000 represented hope in a town where hope had become a luxury few could afford. It was mortgage payments and medical bills, college tuition and dream vacations, everything that seemed impossible in a place where the main industries were poverty and leaving. But everyone present had heard the stories about Thunder, had seen the medical reports, had watched grown men limp away from encounters with the beast that had left them questioning their own mortality. Doc Henderson, 70 years old and still the only veterinarian within 50 miles, shook his graying head as he studied the bull through wire-rimmed spectacles. "That animal's got the devil in him," he muttered to anyone within earshot. "Seen him charge a horse and rider clean through a fence last spring." Lucky they both lived to tell about it. Miss Eleanor, the town librarian who'd taught half the county to read over 5 decades, clutched her Sunday purse tighter as she watched Thunder pace the confines of his pen. "It's not natural," she whispered to her neighbor, "keeping a creature like that penned up. Animals need space to run, to be with their own kind. This ain't right." Sheriff Bobby Ray adjusted his gun belt nervously, his trained eye cataloging potential disasters. At 45, he'd seen enough ranch accidents to fill a morgue, and the liability issues alone made his stomach churn. "Colonel," he called out, "you sure about this? One person gets hurt, and we're looking at lawsuits that'll bury this whole county." But Colonel Thornfield seemed beyond caring about consequences. "Any man who steps into that pen does so at his own risk," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I've got waivers for anyone fool enough to sign them. But I'm telling you now, there ain't enough courage in this entire crowd to make one man walk through that gate." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, acrid and inescapable. Several young cowboys shuffled forward, their pride warring with their survival instincts. But when they looked into Thunder's black eyes and saw the promise of pain reflected there, they found reasons to step back. The bull seemed to sense their fear, his massive head swinging toward the crowd with an intelligence that was somehow more unsettling than simple animal fury. It was then that Tommy O'Sullivan appeared at the edge of the crowd, his small frame barely visible among the adults who towered around him like trees in a forest. He'd walked the 4 miles from the trailer park, his worn sneakers kicking up dust clouds that painted his ankles red with Texas clay. His clothes were clean but threadbare, the kind of carefully maintained poverty that spoke of pride struggling against circumstance. Maggie O'Sullivan had been serving coffee and eggs at Miller's Diner since before dawn, unaware that her nephew had slipped out of their trailer to chase rumors of easy money. Tommy knew about the foreclosure notice hidden beneath his aunt's jewelry box, had seen her counting and recounting the same stack of bills night after night, had heard her crying when she thought he was asleep. 8 years old was too young to understand the complexities of adult finances, but it was old enough to recognize desperation when it lived in the same small space you called home. The boy pushed through the crowd with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose, his blue eyes fixed on the prize money that could save the only family he had left. Adults stepped aside without really seeing him, their attention focused on the spectacle of thunder and the Colonel's impossible challenge. It wasn't until Tommy reached the front of the crowd and placed his small hands on the fence surrounding the bullpen that anyone noticed the child who'd appeared among them. "Jesus Christ," breathed Doc Henderson, his veterinary training immediately recognizing the disaster unfolding before his eyes. "Somebody get that boy away from there." But Tommy had already stepped forward, his voice cutting through the morning air with startling clarity. "Mister, I'll take your bet." The crowd fell silent as every head turned toward the source of that young voice. Colonel Thornfield looked down from his platform, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the small boy standing beside his bullpen. For a moment, something flickered across the rancher's weathered features. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something he'd thought lost forever. "Son," the colonel said slowly, his voice gentler than it had been all morning, "this ain't no place for children. You best run along home to your mama." Tommy's chin lifted with a dignity that seemed far too old for his years. "Don't have a mama, sir, and I need that money." His words carried across the silent crowd, each syllable weighted with the kind of honesty that made adults uncomfortable. "My aunt's gonna lose our house if I don't help her." The crowd began to murmur, voices rising in concern and disbelief. This was a child, barely old enough for 3rd grade, offering to face down a beast that had terrified grown men. But as Tommy stood there beside the pen, something extraordinary happened. Thunder stopped his restless pacing and turned to look directly at the boy, his massive head tilting as if he were listening to something only he could hear. The laughter started as a low chuckle from somewhere in the crowd, then spread like ripples on a pond until half the assembled people were shaking their heads in disbelief. But the laughter died quickly when they saw the expression on Tommy O'Sullivan's face. A quiet determination that spoke of someone who had already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to fear. "Boy's got more grit than sense," muttered Jake Morrison, a ranch hand who'd seen thunder charge through a barn door like it was made of paper. "But grit don't stop a bull from turning you into hamburger meat." Colonel Thornfield climbed down from his platform, his boots hitting the dusty ground with authority. Up close, Tommy could see the deep lines etched around the man's eyes, the kind that came from squinting into too many sunrises and carrying too many burdens. The colonel knelt down until he was at eye level with the boy, studying him with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Son, what's your name?" the colonel asked, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised everyone present, including himself. "Tommy O'Sullivan, sir. I live over at Mockingbird Trailer Park with my Aunt Maggie." The boy's voice never wavered, though his small hands trembled slightly at his sides. "She works real hard, but it ain't enough. We got 3 days before they put our stuff on the curb." A murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Most folks in Millfield knew Maggie O'Sullivan by reputation, a good woman dealt a hard hand by life, working herself to the bone to raise a boy who wasn't even her own blood. The economic realities of small-town Texas meant that everyone present understood the desperation that would drive a child to consider such a dangerous proposition. "Tommy," the colonel said slowly, "that bull has put 2 grown men in the hospital. Professional cowboys, men who've been working with cattle their whole lives. What makes you think an 8-year-old boy can do what they couldn't?" Before Tommy could answer, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd as Maggie O'Sullivan came running toward them, her diner uniform still dusted with flour from the morning breakfast rush. Someone had called Miller's Diner with news that her nephew was about to get himself killed for money, and she'd dropped everything to race across town in her aging pickup truck. "Tommy O'Sullivan, you get away from there right now!" Maggie's voice carried the kind of authority that only comes from genuine terror. She pushed through the crowd like a force of nature, her usually neat appearance disheveled from the mad dash to save her nephew from his own foolish bravery. The boy turned to face his aunt, his young face a mask of resolve. "Aunt Maggie, we need the money. You cry every night when you think I'm sleeping. I can help. I can fix this." The simple honesty of his words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She'd tried so hard to shield Tommy from the weight of their financial troubles, but children see everything, absorb every worry line and midnight tear. She knelt beside the colonel, forming a protective barrier between Tommy and the bullpen. "Baby, listen to me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Some things are more important than money. Losing you would destroy me worse than losing 10 houses. We'll figure something else out, okay? We always do." But Tommy shook his head, his blue eyes reflecting a wisdom far beyond his years. "There ain't no other way, Aunt Maggie. And look." He turned toward Thunder's pen, where something remarkable was happening. The massive bull had approached the fence where Tommy stood, his enormous head lowered as if he were studying the small boy with the same intensity the boy was showing him. Thunder's usual restless pacing had stopped, his aggressive posturing replaced by something that looked almost like curiosity. The bull's black eyes, normally filled with rage and suspicion, seemed to soften as he gazed at the child. "Well, I'll be damned," whispered Doc Henderson, adjusting his glasses to make sure he was seeing clearly. "Never seen Thunder act like that around people. Usually he's all snorts and charges by now." Colonel Thornfield stood slowly, his weathered face troubled as he watched the interaction between boy and beast. Something about the scene stirred memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury, images of another young person who'd had a way with animals that defied explanation. He pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the immediate problem of a child who seemed determined to risk his life for $50,000. "Even if Thunder wasn't dangerous," the colonel said carefully, "the insurance liability alone—" "I'll sign whatever papers you need," Tommy interrupted, his voice steady despite his youth. "I know what I'm doing, sir. And I think Thunder knows I'm not here to hurt him." The crowd had grown larger as word spread through town about the boy who wanted to challenge the meanest bull in 3 counties. News crews from the regional television station were setting up cameras, drawn by the human interest story of desperation and courage playing out in real time. The gathering had taken on the atmosphere of a carnival, complete with vendors selling cold drinks and children climbing on pickup truck bumpers for a better view. Sheriff Bobby Ray pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his hand resting on his radio in case emergency backup was needed. "Colonel, I can't let you do this. A child getting hurt on your property. The legal ramifications alone would shut you down permanently." "The boy wants to try," the colonel replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "And technically it's his choice to make." "Like hell it is," Maggie snapped, rising to her full height despite being barely 5 feet tall. "He's 8 years old. He can't even ride a bicycle without training wheels. And you want him to face down a bull that's hospitalized grown men?" Tommy looked between the adults arguing over his fate, frustration building in his chest. They were talking about him like he wasn't even there, making decisions about his life without asking what he wanted. He'd been powerless when his parents died, powerless when he had to leave the only home he'd ever known, powerless when he watched his aunt work herself to exhaustion trying to keep them afloat. This was the first time in 18 months that he'd found something he could actually do to help, and the grown-ups wanted to take that away from him too. "I'm going to do it whether you let me or not," Tommy announced, his voice cutting through the adult arguments like a knife. The crowd fell silent, recognizing the steel in the young voice. "Thunder ain't mean. Look at him. Really look. He's just sad like me, like Aunt Maggie. Like probably half the people here." And indeed, when the crowd turned to observe the bull, they saw something they'd missed before. Thunder stood quietly at the fence, his massive frame relaxed, his breathing slow and steady. The aggressive snorting and pawing that usually characterized his behavior had vanished, replaced by an almost meditative calm. It was as if the presence of the small boy had awakened something long dormant in the animal's consciousness. Miss Eleanor, who'd been watching the proceedings with the keen eye of someone who'd observed human nature for 7 decades, stepped forward with surprising authority. "Seems to me," she said in her clear teacher's voice, "that boy's got something the rest of us are missing. Maybe we ought to listen to what he's trying to tell us, instead of deciding we know better." Doc Henderson nodded slowly, his veterinary experience recognizing something in Thunder's demeanor that he'd never seen before. "Animal's calmer than I've ever witnessed. Could be the boy's onto something we don't understand." Colonel Thornfield found himself caught between his natural caution and a growing curiosity about what was happening in front of him. The interaction between Tommy and Thunder stirred memories of his son Michael, who'd had a similar gift with animals before tragedy struck their family. Perhaps this was fate offering him a chance at redemption, or perhaps it was just a foolish old man seeing patterns where none existed. "If we do this," the colonel said slowly, "there will be conditions. Safety protocols, medical personnel standing by, and the boy signs nothing. Any liability falls on me." Maggie started to protest, but Tommy had already stepped toward the gate of the bullpen, his small hand reaching for the latch that separated him from $50,000 and a 1,400-pound test of courage. The gate creaked open like the door to another world, its rusty hinges protesting against years of keeping danger contained. Tommy O'Sullivan stepped through that threshold with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds would either save his family or destroy it entirely. Behind him, the crowd held its collective breath, 200 pairs of eyes witnessing what many would later describe as either a miracle or the most foolish act they'd ever seen. Thunder stood 20 feet away, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the small boy whole. The bull's head was lowered, but not in the aggressive posture everyone expected. Instead, he appeared to be studying Tommy with an intelligence that made several spectators shift uncomfortably. This wasn't the mindless aggression they'd heard about in the stories. This was something else entirely, something that defied explanation and challenged everything they thought they knew about both boys and bulls. "Easy, big fellow," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to touch you for 30 seconds, that's all. Then maybe both of us can get what we need." The bull's ears twitched at the sound of the boy's voice, and something remarkable happened. Thunder took a step backward, not in retreat, but in what appeared to be respect for the small human who'd entered his domain. The movement sent a ripple of amazement through the watching crowd, many of whom had never seen the notorious bull give ground to anyone or anything. Doc Henderson stood with his veterinary bag clutched in his weathered hands, his 70 years of experience with animals telling him that what he was witnessing shouldn't be possible. "That bull's reading the boy like a book," he murmured to Sheriff Bobby Ray, who had his radio ready to call for emergency medical assistance. "Animals know things about people that we've forgotten how to see." Maggie O'Sullivan pressed her face against the fence, her knuckles white where she gripped the steel mesh. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to throw open that gate and drag her nephew to safety, but something deeper held her back. The recognition that Tommy was about to prove something important, not just to the crowd or to Colonel Thornfield, but to himself. Tommy took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He'd learned something important during his 18 months as an orphan. That loss and loneliness created a language all their own, and those who'd suffered recognized each other across all boundaries of species and circumstance. In Thunder's dark eyes, he saw the same isolation he felt every time he woke up in the narrow bunk bed, and remembered for just a moment that his parents were never coming home. "I know how it feels," Tommy said softly, now close enough that Thunder could have ended the experiment with one swift movement of his massive head. "Being all alone, with everybody afraid of you, or wanting to put you somewhere you don't belong. They think you're dangerous, but really you're just tired of hurting all the time." Thunder's breathing slowed, his enormous chest rising and falling in rhythm with the boy's words. The bull lowered his head further, bringing his eyes level with Tommy's, and in that moment, something passed between them that transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal. It was recognition, pure and simple, two souls who'd been marked by loss finding solace in each other's company. Colonel Thornfield watched from his position near the fence, his weathered face a mask of conflicting emotions. The scene unfolding before him stirred memories he'd spent 3 years trying to suppress, images of his son Michael working with the ranch animals with the same gentle confidence Tommy was displaying now. The colonel's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the fence post, torn between the desire to stop this dangerous exhibition and the growing certainty that he was witnessing something extraordinary. The crowd had grown to nearly 300 people as word spread through Millfield and the surrounding ranches. Cars and pickup trucks lined the dirt road leading to the Thornfield property, their occupants drawn by curiosity and the promise of either witnessing history or disaster. Local television crews had arrived from Austin, their cameras capturing every moment of the unprecedented encounter between boy and bull. Miss Eleanor, standing near the back of the crowd with the authority of someone who'd taught half the county to read, found herself thinking about the stories she'd read to countless children over the decades. There were always tales of young heroes facing impossible odds, of courage triumphing over fear, of the power of understanding to bridge the gap between different worlds. But this wasn't a fairy tale. This was real life, playing out in the Texas heat with stakes that could destroy or transform multiple lives. Tommy reached out his hand slowly, his small fingers extended toward Thunder's massive head. The bull remained perfectly still, as if he understood the significance of this moment, as if he recognized that the small human before him carried the power to change both their destinies. When Tommy's palm finally made contact with the warm hide between Thunder's eyes, the entire crowd seemed to exhale at once. "One!" called out Sheriff Bobby Ray, beginning the count that would determine whether $50,000 changed hands. 2, 3. But Tommy wasn't thinking about money anymore. Under his palm he could feel Thunder's pulse, strong and steady, and beneath that the unmistakable rhythm of a heart that had known too much pain and too little kindness. The bull's hide was warm from the Texas sun, scarred from years of isolation and conflict, but somehow familiar in the way that all wounded things recognize each other. "You miss them, don't you?" Tommy whispered. His words meant only for Thunder's ears. The other animals, the people who used to care about you before everything went wrong. I miss mine, too. But maybe if we help each other, we won't have to be alone anymore." Thunder's response was subtle but unmistakable. A slight relaxation of his massive frame, a soft exhalation that might have been relief or resignation or something approaching trust. The bull's eyes, which had terrorized grown men for 3 years, showed nothing but gentleness as he gazed at the small boy who'd somehow found the key to unlocking his guarded heart. 15, the sheriff continued, his voice carrying a note of amazement that matched the expressions on faces throughout the crowd. 16, 17. Doc Henderson found himself thinking about all the animals he'd treated over his long career, from prize stallions to barn cats, and how the best healing always came from understanding rather than force. What Tommy was doing wasn't magic or luck, it was the application of empathy so pure and instinctive that it transcended the normal rules governing human-animal interaction. The 30 seconds stretched like an eternity, each number called out by Sheriff Bobby Ray, marking another moment of connection between boy and bull. Tommy kept his hand steady on Thunder's head, feeling the animal's breathing synchronize with his own, sensing the gradual release of tension that had held the bull captive for years. 28, 29, 30. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, but Tommy barely heard them. He was lost in the moment of connection with Thunder, understanding for the first time in 18 months that he wasn't completely powerless in a world that seemed determined to take away everything he loved. He'd found something he could do, someone he could help, a way to make a difference that didn't depend on being bigger or stronger or older than his years. Colonel Thornfield stepped forward, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. In 30 seconds, this 8-year-old boy had accomplished what no grown man had managed in 3 years. He'd reached through Thunder's wall of defensive aggression and found the gentle animal that lay beneath. The colonel's hand shook as he reached for his wallet, preparing to make good on a bet he'd never expected to lose. But before he could speak, Tommy did something that no one anticipated. Instead of stepping away from Thunder to claim his prize, the boy moved closer to the bull, wrapping his thin arms around the animal's massive neck in an embrace that spoke of understanding and acceptance rather than conquest. "Thank you," Tommy whispered into Thunder's ear, "for letting me help, for showing everybody that you're not what they thought you were." Thunder stood perfectly still, accepting the embrace with a dignity that transformed him in the eyes of everyone present from a dangerous beast into something approaching nobility. The bull's head turned slightly, nuzzling the boy with a gentleness that made several spectators wipe tears from their eyes. Maggie O'Sullivan found herself crying as she watched her nephew demonstrate a courage and compassion that put most adults to shame. She'd raised Tommy to be kind and honest, but this went beyond anything she could have taught him. This was something that came from deep inside, from the part of his spirit that remained unbroken, despite all the losses he'd endured. The television cameras captured every moment of the extraordinary scene, but no amount of film or digital recording could convey the full impact of what had just occurred. It was one of those rare instances when the impossible became routine, when a child's innocence proved more powerful than adult cynicism, when understanding triumphed over fear. As Tommy finally stepped away from Thunder, the bull made no move to follow or threaten. Instead, he simply watched the boy with those intelligent dark eyes, as if memorizing every detail of the small human who'd given him the first moment of peace he'd known in 3 years. Colonel Thornfield approached the pen gate, his movements slow and deliberate. The wallet in his hands contained exactly $50,000 in cash, money that could solve every problem facing Tommy and Maggie O'Sullivan. But as he looked at the boy who'd just accomplished the impossible, the colonel found himself thinking about more than just honoring a bet. "Son," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of emotion that surprised everyone present, including himself. "You've just done something I've never seen before. That bull has been nothing but trouble for 3 years, and you walked in there and made him gentle as a lamb. How did you know?" Tommy looked up at the tall rancher, his young face serious beyond his years. "He's not mean, sir. He's just been hurt and nobody took the time to understand. Sometimes when you've lost everything, people think you're dangerous when really you're just scared and lonely." The simple wisdom of the boy's words hit Colonel Thornfield like a physical blow, stirring memories and emotions he'd kept buried since his son's death. In that moment, looking at Tommy O'Sullivan's earnest face, the colonel began to understand that this encounter was about much more than money or bulls or even the salvation of a family facing eviction. This was about redemption, about second chances, about the possibility that even the most broken hearts could be healed by understanding and compassion. And as he reached for the gate to let Tommy out of the pen, Colonel Thornfield found himself wondering if perhaps fate had brought this remarkable boy into his life for reasons that went far beyond a simple wager. The crowd's cheers died down as Colonel Thornfield reached for his wallet, but something in his expression suggested this moment was far from over. The weathered rancher's hands trembled slightly as he counted out the bills, his eyes never leaving Tommy's face. Behind him, Thunder remained at the fence, watching the proceedings with an intelligence that made several spectators shift uncomfortably. "$50,000 as promised," the colonel said, his voice carrying a strange mixture of respect and something that might have been regret. He extended the money toward Tommy, but then pulled it back suddenly. "But I have one more challenge for you, son." The crowd stirred uneasily. Maggie O'Sullivan felt her heart drop into her stomach as she gripped the fence tighter. "William Thornfield, don't you dare!" she called out, her voice sharp with maternal fury. "That boy has done more than enough." "You give him that money and let us go home." But Tommy was already listening, his young face serious as he studied the colonel's weathered features. Something in the man's eyes told him this wasn't about more money or bigger risks. This was about something deeper, something that had been eating away at the rancher's soul for longer than anyone realized. "What kind of challenge?" Tommy asked quietly, ignoring his aunt's protests and the worried murmurs from the crowd. Colonel Thornfield glanced toward the pen where Thunder waited, then back at the boy who'd just accomplished the impossible. "Ride him," he said simply. "If you can stay on Thunder's back for 1 minute, just 60 seconds, I'll double the bet. $100,000. The crowd exploded in shouts of protest and disbelief. Even the most hardened cowboys present knew that riding a bull like Thunder wasn't just dangerous, it was potentially fatal. Professional rodeo riders trained for years to handle much smaller, less aggressive animals, and even they ended up in hospitals on a regular basis. "You've lost your damn mind," Sheriff Bobby Ray declared, stepping forward with his hand on his radio. "I can't allow this. We're talking about a child's life here." Doc Henderson pushed through the crowd, his veterinary bag clutched in his weathered hands. "Colonel, that bull could kill the boy with one wrong move. What you're suggesting isn't just dangerous, it's criminal." But Colonel Thornfield's attention remained fixed on Tommy, studying the boy's reaction with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Something about this child reminded him so powerfully of his lost son that it physically hurt to look at him. Michael had possessed the same fearless compassion, the same intuitive understanding of animals that defied logical explanation. "Why?" Tommy asked, his voice cutting through the adult arguments like a knife. "Why do you want me to ride him?" The question stopped Colonel Thornfield cold. Why indeed? What was driving him to push this remarkable boy toward even greater danger? The honest answer was too painful to voice. That watching Tommy connect with Thunder had awakened a grief so profound It threatened to destroy him all over again. "Because," the colonel said slowly, his voice barely audible over the crowd's protests, "I need to know if what I just saw was real or just a lucky accident. I need to know if you truly understand that animal, or if we're all just fooling ourselves." Tommy studied the older man's face, seeing something there that the adults around them were missing. This wasn't about money or spectacle or even proving a point. This was about a man who'd lost something precious and was desperate to find proof that connections like the one Tommy had just demonstrated were real and lasting. "Colonel," Miss Eleanor's clear teacher's voice cut through the chaos, "what you're asking isn't fair to the boy or to your own conscience. Some things are worth more than proving a point." But Tommy had already made his decision. He turned toward Thunder's pen, where the massive bull stood watching the human drama unfold with those intelligent dark eyes. The animal's posture was relaxed, almost patient, as if he understood that his fate was being decided by the small human who'd shown him kindness. "I'll do it," Tommy announced, his young voice carrying a finality that silenced the crowd. "But not for the money. I'll do it because Thunder wants me to." The statement sent another wave of protest through the gathered spectators, but Tommy was already walking back toward the pen gate. Maggie O'Sullivan broke through the crowd's restraining hands and grabbed her nephew's arm, her face pale with terror. "Tommy, no," she pleaded, kneeling down to look directly into his eyes. "Baby, we don't need that money badly enough for you to risk your life. We'll figure out another way. We always do." Tommy gently pulled free from his aunt's grasp, his expression serious beyond his years. "Aunt Maggie, look at Thunder. Really look at him. He's not angry anymore. He's waiting for me to help him show everybody who he really is underneath all that hurt." Indeed, Thunder had moved closer to the fence, his massive head lowered as if in invitation. The aggressive posturing that had characterized his behavior for 3 years was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he projected an almost serene patience, as if he'd finally found someone who understood his true nature. Doc Henderson approached Tommy with his veterinary expertise focused on the bull's behavior. "Son, I've been working with animals for 50 years, and I've never seen Thunder act like this. But riding a bull isn't like petting one. Even the gentlest bull can buck when something's on his back. It's pure instinct." "He won't hurt me," Tommy replied with quiet certainty. "I can feel it. He's tired of being angry all the time. He wants to show people that he can be trusted." Colonel Thornfield found himself caught between admiration for the boy's courage and horror at what he was potentially allowing to happen. The money meant nothing to him. He had enough debt that $100,000 was just another drop in an ocean of financial ruin. What mattered was the growing certainty that this child possessed something that had died with his son Michael, something that made the impossible seem routine. The television crews were already repositioning their cameras for better angles, recognizing that they were potentially about to capture either a historic moment of human-animal connection or a tragedy that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The crowd had swelled to over 400 people as word spread through the surrounding counties, drawn by reports of the boy who could calm the meanest bull in Texas. Tommy approached Thunder's pen for the second time, but now the atmosphere was entirely different. The first encounter had been about proving that connection was possible. This one was about demonstrating that trust could transcend the normal boundaries between species and circumstance. Thunder stood perfectly still as Tommy opened the gate and stepped inside. The bull's massive frame seemed to relax even further, as if the boy's presence brought him a peace he'd forgotten was possible. When Tommy placed his hand on Thunder's neck, the animal actually lowered himself slightly, making it easier for the small boy to climb onto his back. "Sweet Jesus," breathed Doc Henderson as he watched Tommy settle himself between Thunder's massive shoulder blades. That bull's actually helping him mount up." The crowd fell silent as Tommy secured his seat on Thunder's broad back, his small hands gripping the animal's thick neck rather than the rope that professional riders used. He sat there for a moment, feeling the rhythm of Thunder's breathing, sensing the careful control the bull was exercising to keep his small passenger safe. "You ready, big fellow?" Tommy whispered into Thunder's ear. "Let's show them what we can do together." Thunder's response was to stand slowly, raising Tommy 8 feet off the ground with a gentleness that defied everything the spectators thought they knew about bull riding. The animal began to move around the pen with measured steps, his gait smooth and controlled, more like a gentle horse than a rodeo bull. Sheriff Bobby Ray began the count again, his voice tight with tension. 1, 2, 3. Each number seemed to stretch into eternity as the crowd watched in amazement. Tommy rode with perfect balance, moving in harmony with Thunder's careful steps, the two of them creating an image that would be remembered long after the last spectator went home. 30, 31, 32. The sheriff's count continued, but it was clear that Thunder had no intention of bucking or attempting to dislodge his rider. Instead, the bull seemed to take pride in carrying the boy safely, his movements deliberate and protective. Colonel Thornfield watched with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, seeing in Tommy and Thunder's partnership an echo of the connection his son Michael had shared with animals before tragedy struck their family. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a reminder of what had been lost and a glimpse of what might still be possible. As the count reached 60 seconds, Thunder came to a gentle stop in the center of the pen and carefully lowered himself again, allowing Tommy to slide safely to the ground. The boy immediately wrapped his arms around the bull's massive neck, and Thunder responded by nuzzling him with a tenderness that left the entire crowd speechless. The applause that followed was different from before, quieter, more respectful, as if the spectators recognized they'd witnessed something sacred. This wasn't just about a boy riding a bull. It was about the power of understanding to transform fear into trust, anger into acceptance, isolation into connection. But as Tommy stepped away from Thunder and walked toward the pen gate where Colonel Thornfield waited with $100,000 in cash, none of them realized that the most difficult part of their journey was just beginning. The first crack in the perfect moment came when Colonel Thornfield's hand trembled so violently that the $100 bills scattered in the Texas wind like autumn leaves. His weathered face had gone ashen, and for a terrifying moment, Doc Henderson thought the man was having a heart attack. But it wasn't his heart that was failing. It was his carefully constructed wall of denial finally crumbling under the weight of what he'd just witnessed. "Michael," the colonel whispered, his voice so broken that only Tommy, standing closest to him, could hear the name. "Oh God, Michael, I'm so sorry." The crowd's celebration died as they watched their town's most powerful man collapse to his knees in the dirt, his body racked with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. Sheriff Bobby Ray moved toward him, but Colonel Thornfield waved him away, his attention fixed entirely on Tommy, who stood frozen in confusion at the gate of Thunder's pen. "Who's Michael?" Tommy asked softly, his young voice cutting through the heavy silence that had fallen over the assembled crowd. Colonel Thornfield looked up at him with eyes that held 3 years of buried anguish. "My son, he would have been 21 this year. And that bull—" His voice broke completely as he pointed toward Thunder, who stood watching the human drama with those intelligent dark eyes. That was his bull, his best friend in the whole world. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Suddenly, Thunder's behavior made terrible sense. The aggression, the isolation, the 3 years of barely contained rage. The bull hadn't been naturally violent. He'd been grieving the loss of the one person who'd truly understood him. Maggie O'Sullivan felt her legs go weak as the implications crashed over her. "Colonel," she said quietly, "what happened to your son?" The answer came not from Colonel Thornfield, but from Miss Eleanor, whose 60 years in Millfield had made her keeper of the town's collective memory. "Suicide," she said simply, her teacher's voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. 3 years ago this October. Found him in the barn with his daddy's hunting rifle. Tommy stared at the weeping man before him, understanding flooding through his 8-year-old mind with devastating clarity. Thunder hadn't been punishing random strangers for 3 years. He'd been searching for Michael, growing more desperate and angry with each passing day that his beloved companion failed to return. "That's why Thunder was so sad," Tommy said, his voice barely audible. "He's been waiting for Michael to come back." Colonel Thornfield's sobs intensified at the boy's words. "I couldn't stand looking at that damn bull," he choked out between gasps. "Every time I saw Thunder, I saw my boy. Saw how I failed him, how I pushed him so hard that he chose to leave rather than disappoint me again." Doc Henderson knelt beside the broken rancher, his veterinary training extending to humans in crisis. "William, you need to breathe. Deep breaths. That's it." But Tommy was already moving, stepping away from the gate and approaching the colonel with the same fearless compassion he'd shown Thunder. "It's not your fault," he said simply, placing his small hand on the man's shoulder. "Sometimes people hurt so much that they can't see any other way out. But Michael wouldn't want Thunder to be sad forever, and he wouldn't want you to be sad forever either." The simple wisdom from an 8-year-old orphan shattered what remained of Colonel Thornfield's composure. He pulled Tommy into a desperate embrace, holding the boy as if he were a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. "I don't know how to make any of it right." Behind them, Thunder had moved to the fence, his massive head pressed against the metal mesh as if he were trying to reach the humans who were finally talking about the boy he'd loved and lost. The bull's eyes held a clarity that made several spectators step back. This wasn't just an animal anymore, but a grieving soul finally being acknowledged. Sheriff Bobby Ray cleared his throat, his law enforcement training struggling to process the emotional devastation unfolding before him. "Colonel, maybe we should postpone any financial transactions until—" "No," Colonel Thornfield said firmly, releasing Tommy but keeping his hands on the boy's shoulders. "A bet's a bet. This child earned every penny of that money, and more." He began gathering the scattered bills from the dirt, his movements mechanical but determined. Tommy watched the older man collect the money that could save his family from eviction, but something felt wrong about taking it now. This wasn't about a wager anymore. This was about a family destroyed by grief, and a bull who'd been punished for loving someone who couldn't be saved. "Colonel," Tommy said quietly, "I don't want the money." The statement sent another shock through the crowd. Maggie O'Sullivan stepped forward, her face pale with disbelief. "Tommy, honey, what are you saying? We need that money." "You know we do." But Tommy's attention remained fixed on Colonel Thornfield's ravaged face. "You miss Michael like I miss my mom and dad," he said with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "And Thunder misses him too. That's why he was so angry. He thought everyone forgot about Michael." Colonel Thornfield stared at the boy in amazement. "How could you possibly understand?" "Because I get angry sometimes too," Tommy interrupted. "When people act like my parents never existed, or when they try to make me forget them because it makes them uncomfortable. Thunder wasn't being mean, he was trying to make people remember." The crowd had grown completely silent, everyone present recognizing that they were witnessing something far more profound than a simple wager between man and boy. This was about grief and healing, about the connections that transcend death, about the possibility that love could bridge any gap if given the chance. Miss Eleanor stepped forward, her teacher's instincts recognizing a moment of profound learning. "Tommy's right," she said clearly. "We've all been so afraid of Thunder that we forgot he was grieving just like the rest of us. That bull loved Michael Thornfield as much as any of us did." Doc Henderson nodded slowly, his veterinary experience finally making sense of 3 years of inexplicable animal behavior. Animals grieve differently than humans, but they grieve just as deeply. Thunder's aggression was never random. It was the acting out of a broken heart. Colonel Thornfield looked between Tommy and Thunder, seeing for the first time the connection he'd been too blinded by grief to recognize. "My boy loved that bull more than anything else in the world," he said quietly. "Used to say Thunder understood him better than I ever did." The admission hung in the air like smoke, acrid with the truth of missed opportunities and failures of understanding. Tommy felt tears burning his eyes, not for himself this time, but for the man before him who'd lost his son and then compounded that loss by punishing the one creature who'd loved Michael unconditionally. "Thunder still loves him," Tommy said softly. "He always will. But he's ready to love other people too, if you let him." Colonel Thornfield looked toward the pen where Thunder waited, the bull's massive frame no longer seeming threatening, but merely sad. For 3 years, he'd seen that animal as a reminder of his failures as a father. Now, through the eyes of an 8-year-old orphan, he began to see Thunder as something else entirely, the living embodiment of his son's capacity for love and connection. "What am I supposed to do?" Colonel Thornfield asked, his voice broken but seeking. "How do I make this right?" Tommy looked between the grieving man and the grieving bull, understanding with startling clarity what needed to happen. "You start by forgiving yourself," he said simply. "And then you let Thunder help you remember the good parts about Michael instead of just the sad ending." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Thunder moved closer to the fence, his intelligent eyes fixed on the colonel with something that looked remarkably like forgiveness. The bull's posture held none of the aggression that had terrorized the county for 3 years. Instead, he projected the same patient gentleness he'd shown Tommy, as if he were offering his former tormentor a chance at redemption. Colonel Thornfield rose slowly to his feet, the scattered money forgotten in the dirt as he approached the fence where Thunder waited. 3 years of mutual grief and misunderstanding stretched between them like a chasm, but Tommy's words had built a bridge that neither man nor beast had dared to cross until now. What happened next would be talked about in Millfield for generations to come. Colonel Thornfield approached Thunder's fence with trembling hands, his weathered face streaked with tears and dirt. The bull, who had terrorized grown men for 3 years, stood perfectly still as the man who had imprisoned him reached through the mesh to touch his massive head. "I'm sorry, boy," the colonel whispered, his voice breaking on each word. "I'm so damn sorry for what I did to you. You were grieving too, weren't you? All this time, you were just missing my boy as much as I was." Thunder's response shattered every heart present. The enormous bull pressed his head against the colonel's hand and released a sound that was part moan, part sigh, the vocalization of 3 years of pent-up sorrow finally being acknowledged and understood. It was the sound of grief recognized, of pain shared, of forgiveness offered from the most unexpected source. But even as this moment of healing unfolded, a new crisis was emerging. Maggie O'Sullivan, who had been watching the emotional reunion with tears in her eyes, suddenly gasped and pointed toward the road. A black sedan with county plates was pulling into the ranch driveway, followed by a tow truck that could only mean one thing. "Oh no," she breathed, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. "They've come for our trailer," Sheriff Bobby Ray squinted at the approaching vehicles, his expression grim. "That's the county assessor's office. And Jenkins Towing. Maggie, how far behind are you on your lot rent?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone present knew the answer. Far enough behind that legal action was not just possible but inevitable. The 3-day notice had expired while they'd been witnessing miracles, and bureaucracy waited for no one, not even 8-year-old boys who could tame savage bulls. Tommy watched the vehicles approach with a sinking heart, understanding that all of his courage and Thunder's cooperation might not be enough to save his family from homelessness. The $100,000 lay scattered in the dirt around Colonel Thornfield's feet, but even if they gathered every bill, there might not be time to stop the legal machinery already in motion. $4,700, Maggie said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of approaching engines. "Plus penalties and court costs. They're going to put our things on the street, Tommy. Today." The county assessor, a thin man in an ill-fitting suit, climbed out of the sedan with a clipboard and the officious air of someone who'd done this too many times to feel much sympathy for the families he displaced. Behind him, the tow truck driver was already sizing up the modest trailer that represented everything Tommy and Maggie owned in the world. "Margaret O'Sullivan," the assessor called out, his voice carrying the mechanical politeness of bureaucratic necessity. "I have a court order for immediate seizure of property in lieu of unpaid fees. You have 30 minutes to remove personal belongings before we proceed with eviction." The crowd stirred angrily, several voices calling out protests, but Sheriff Bobby Ray held up his hand for silence. "This is a legal matter," he said reluctantly. "Much as I hate it, the county has the right—" "Wait!" Colonel Thornfield's voice cut through the protests like a knife. He was standing now, his grief temporarily set aside as he processed what was happening. "Maggie, did you say $4,700? She nodded, unable to speak through the tears that had started flowing the moment she saw the official vehicles. Colonel Thornfield looked at the money scattered around his feet, then at Tommy, who stood between Thunder's pen and his aunt with the expression of someone watching his world collapse in real time. The colonel's weathered face hardened with resolve as he began gathering the bills from the dirt. "Here," he said, striding toward the county assessor with a handful of cash. $5,000. That should cover what they owe plus your fees and penalties." The assessor looked startled, clearly not expecting this turn of events. "Sir, I'll need to verify the amount and get proper documentation." "You'll verify it right here and now," Colonel Thornfield said, his military bearing reasserting itself. "Bobby Ray can witness the transaction. This family isn't losing their home today." But Tommy stepped between the colonel and the county assessor, his young face serious beyond his years. "No, sir," he said quietly. "That's not right either." Everyone stared at the 8-year-old boy who seemed determined to reject every offer of help that came his way. Maggie reached for her nephew's hand, panic evident in her voice. "Tommy, honey, what are you doing? The colonel is trying to help us." Tommy looked up at Colonel Thornfield with eyes that held wisdom far beyond his years. "You're trying to pay our debt because you feel guilty about Michael and Thunder," he said simply. "But that's not going to fix anything. It's just going to make you feel worse later." The brutal honesty of the statement hit the colonel like a physical blow. The boy was right. The desperate urge to save Tommy and Maggie was driven more by guilt than genuine charity, an attempt to assuage his conscience rather than solve the real problems at hand. Doc Henderson stepped forward, his veterinary training extending to recognizing emotional wounds in humans as well as animals. "The boy's got a point, William. You can't buy your way out of grief any more than you could punish your way out of it." Miss Eleanor nodded approvingly, her teacher's instincts recognizing a profound lesson being taught by the most unexpected instructor. "Tommy's trying to tell us something important. Maybe we should listen instead of trying to fix everything with money." Tommy turned to face the crowd, his small voice carrying clearly in the Texas heat. "Aunt Maggie and I have been poor before. We'll figure out how to be poor again if we have to, but Thunder and the Colonel need each other more than we need their money." The statement sent a ripple of understanding through the assembled spectators. This wasn't just about saving a family from eviction. It was about healing wounds that went far deeper than financial troubles. Tommy had recognized something the adults had missed, that true healing couldn't be purchased, only earned through genuine connection and understanding. Colonel Thornfield stared at the boy in amazement. "Son, you're willing to lose your home to help an old fool and his bull work through their grief?" "It's not about helping you," Tommy replied with devastating honesty. "It's about doing what's right. Michael wouldn't want you to feel guilty forever, and Thunder shouldn't have to stay sad because grown-ups can't figure out how to deal with their feelings." The county assessor cleared his throat impatiently, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional drama unfolding around his routine eviction. "Folks, I sympathize with your situation, but I have a legal obligation here. Unless someone can pay the outstanding fees, I need to proceed with the seizure." Sheriff Bobby Ray looked torn between his duty to enforce the law and his growing conviction that they were witnessing something that transcended normal legal procedures. "There's got to be another way," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. It was then that Miss Eleanor stepped forward with the quiet authority of someone who'd been observing human nature for 75 years. "Actually," she said, reaching into her Sunday purse, "there is." The elderly librarian pulled out a worn leather checkbook and began writing with the deliberate strokes of someone who'd made an important decision. "I've been saving my pension money for 20 years, waiting for something worth spending it on. I believe I just found it." She tore off the check and handed it to the county assessor, who examined it with professional skepticism before his eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Ma'am, this is for $10,000. The total amount due is only—" "I know exactly what it's for," Miss Eleanor interrupted with gentle firmness. "The extra money is to establish a fund for other families facing similar situations. Consider it an investment in community preservation." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Tommy found himself crying for the first time since entering Thunder's pen. These weren't tears of joy or relief. They were tears of understanding. Miss Eleanor had just demonstrated something that all the bull riding and money counting in the world couldn't teach. That real strength came not from conquering fear or accumulating wealth, but from recognizing when someone needed help and having the courage to provide it. Colonel Thornfield watched the elderly librarian save the O'Sullivan family with quiet grace, and for the first time in 3 years, he began to understand what his son Michael had tried to tell him about the true nature of courage and compassion. 6 months later, the morning sun painted the Thornfield ranch in shades of gold and amber that would have taken Tommy's breath away if he hadn't already grown accustomed to the daily miracle of waking up in a place he could finally call home. The modest apartment above the ranch's main barn had become a sanctuary for him and Aunt Maggie, who'd discovered that her long-dormant veterinary skills were exactly what the ranch needed to thrive again. Thunder grazed peacefully in the main pasture, no longer isolated behind steel mesh but free to roam among the other cattle as nature intended. His massive frame had filled out over the months, the stress-induced weight loss reversing as his emotional wounds healed alongside his physical ones. Most remarkably, he'd become the gentlest leader the herd had ever known, his intelligence and natural authority making him a stabilizing presence for the entire ranch. Colonel Thornfield emerged from the main house carrying 2 cups of coffee, his weathered face bearing an expression of contentment that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who'd known him during his years of grief. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, healing never did, but it had been thorough and genuine. Working alongside Tommy and Maggie to restore the ranch had given him purpose beyond mere survival, a reason to build rather than simply endure. "Morning, partner," the colonel said, handing Tommy one of the cups, hot chocolate disguised as coffee, to make the 8-year-old feel more grown up. It had become their daily ritual, these quiet moments before the ranch work began, when they could simply be themselves without the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. Tommy accepted the cup gratefully, his small hands wrapped around its warmth, despite the Texas heat that would soon make such comfort unbearable. "Thunder's teaching the new calves again," he observed, nodding toward the pasture where the massive bull was gently nudging a young calf away from a dangerous section of fence. "He's got good instincts," Colonel Thornfield agreed, watching his former tormentor demonstrate the protective patience that had always been his true nature. "Michael always said Thunder was the smartest animal on the ranch." Guess he was right about that, like he was right about most things. The mention of Michael no longer brought the crushing weight of guilt it once had. Instead, it carried the bittersweet comfort of remembered love, the acknowledgement that some connections transcend death and continue to guide the living toward better choices. Tommy had taught them all that grief could be transformed into something productive without being diminished or forgotten. Miss Eleanor's investment in the community had grown beyond anyone's expectations. The fund she'd established had helped 3 other families avoid eviction, and her example had inspired others to contribute. Millfield was beginning to thrive again, its economy boosted by visitors who came to see the ranch where a boy had tamed a bull and healed a broken man's heart. As Tommy and Colonel Thornfield stood side by side watching Thunder tend to his herd, both understood that they'd found something more valuable than money or property. They'd found family, chosen rather than inherited, built on understanding rather than obligation. Some stories end with victory, others with loss. The best stories end with the promise that love, patience, and forgiveness can transform even the most broken hearts into something beautiful. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't about conquering our fears, but about finding the courage to open our hearts when life has given us every reason to keep them closed. Tommy O'Sullivan's story reminds us that healing doesn't require forgetting our pain. It requires transforming that pain into compassion for others who are hurting. At 55, 60, or beyond, we've all carried burdens that felt too heavy to bear, faced losses that seemed to define us rather than refine us. But like Colonel Thornfield discovered, our greatest griefs can become our greatest gifts when we allow them to connect us with others who need what only we can offer. Thunder the bull wasn't really fierce. He was just lonely and misunderstood, much like many of us become when life doesn't unfold as we planned. The beauty of this story lies not in an 8-year-old's bravery, but in the reminder that it's never too late to choose connection over isolation, forgiveness over bitterness, hope over resignation. Every day offers us the chance to be someone's Colonel Thornfield, learning to see past the surface to the heart that's crying out for understanding. What broken relationship in your life might benefit from a child's wisdom about forgiveness? Have you ever discovered that someone you thought was difficult was actually just hurting?